Welcome to Warfare Codex. If you enjoy fascinating and unusual history, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more incredible stories. Now, let's dive into the strange and extraordinary world of history's most unique individuals. 1. Roman slavery and the horrific human trade. The Roman Empire's economy and military might were built on the backs of slaves. At the height of the empire, it's estimated that as much as 30% of the population were slaves, some of them captured from distant lands, while others were born into servitude. Slaves were considered nothing more than property, with no rights, no voice, and no hope for freedom unless they could somehow earn it. The most disturbing aspect of Roman slavery was the sheer brutality of their treatment. They were forced to work in mines, on farms, and even as gladiators in the brutal, blood-soaked arenas. These gladiators were often prisoners of war or slaves who had no choice but to fight to the death for the entertainment of the public. Those who tried to rebel, like the famous slave leader Spartacus, were met with unimaginable cruelty. After his rebellion was crushed, 6,000 of his followers were crucified along the Appian Way, their bodies left hanging in the sun as a gruesome public spectacle. This horrific punishment was meant to remind the Roman people of the fate that awaited any slave who dared to defy the empire. 2. The Spanish Inquisition and the torture of heretics. Imagine living in a time when a simple disagreement over religious beliefs could lead to unimaginable suffering. During the Spanish Inquisition, which began in the late 15th century, this nightmare became a brutal reality. The Spanish Inquisition was a religious institution led by the Catholic Church, tasked with rooting out heresy and ensuring that the population remained devoutly Catholic. Those accused of heresy were subjected to horrifying torture in an effort to extract confessions. The infamous rack stretched victims until their bones were dislocated, while waterboarding was used to simulate drowning. But these were just the beginning. Victims were often burned alive at the stake, their bodies consumed by flames while the crowds cheered. But the most terrifying part of the Inquisition was the paranoia it caused. Entire families were torn apart. As children were coerced into betraying their parents, neighbors turned on each other, and people were falsely accused simply out of fear of being next. The Inquisition lasted for centuries, resulting in the deaths of thousands and leaving a lasting scar on Spain and its people. 3. The 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. In 1918, a virus emerged that would devastate the world in a way that few could have imagined. The Spanish flu pandemic is often considered the deadliest in modern history, surpassing even the death toll of World War I. While many of us know of COVID-19 and its impact, the Spanish flu killed an estimated 50 million people worldwide in just a year, with some estimates even suggesting that the true death toll could have been as high as 100 million. What made the Spanish flu so terrifying was its ability to kill healthy young adults, unlike other viruses that typically target the elderly or immunocompromised. Healthy, active individuals between the ages of 20 and 40 were suddenly struck down, often within days of showing symptoms. Hospitals were overwhelmed, and there was no effective treatment or vaccine. Entire cities were quarantined, people were forced to wear masks, and the economy ground to a halt as people died at an unprecedented rate. Despite its catastrophic impact, the Spanish flu left many questions unanswered. How did it spread so quickly? Why did it strike young, healthy people so viciously? The origins of the pandemic remain shrouded in mystery to this day. 4. The Holocaust and Nazi atrocities. The Holocaust stands as one of the most horrifying events in human history, an atrocity that saw the systematic extermination of 6 million Jews, along with millions of Romani people, disabled individuals, and others deemed undesirable by the Nazi regime. Under Adolf Hitler's leadership, the Nazi Party built a terrifying machinery of death. In the death camps, Jews and other minorities were forced into slave labor, where they were subjected to starvation, disease, and inhumane working conditions. But worse still was the Nazi obsession with dehumanizing their victims. The most notorious of these camps, Auschwitz, became a symbol of absolute evil. Here, men, women, and children were stripped of their identities, their families torn apart, and many sent directly to the gas chambers where they would be murdered in the most efficient yet coldly calculated way possible. Those who didn't die immediately were subjected to horrific medical experiments, often carried out without anesthesia or any regard for human life. The scale of the horror was unimaginable. Entire communities were wiped off the map, and the legacy of this genocide continues to haunt humanity. 5. The Great Chinese Cultural Revolution, 1966 to 1976. From 1966 to 1970, China was thrown into chaos during the Cultural Revolution, a period in which Mao Zedong sought to eradicate traditional culture and enforce strict communist ideology. The revolution was marked by widespread violence, oppression, and human suffering. Intellectuals, teachers, and anyone perceived as an enemy of the state were brutally persecuted. People were publicly humiliated, tortured, and in some cases executed. The infamous Red Guards, a youth militia, were given the power to attack anyone they deemed counter-revolutionary. Schools and universities were shut down, and intellectuals were either sent to rural farms for re-education or outright killed. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Cultural Revolution was the way it pitted families and friends against one another. Children were encouraged to denounce their parents, students ratted out their teachers, and neighbors turned on each other, all in the name of ideological purity. The Cultural Revolution left an indelible scar on Chinese society, with millions suffering from violence, torture, and displacement. And even today, many of the victims of this horrific period have never been properly acknowledged or remembered. 6. Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The terrifying power of atomic bombs. On August 6th and 9th, 1945, during the final days of World War II, the United States dropped atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These bombings remain some of the most horrifying and controversial events in human history, not only because of the sheer scale of destruction they caused, but also because of the long-lasting effects they had on the survivors. The bomb dropped on Hiroshima killed an estimated 140,000 people instantly, or from radiation sickness. The city was reduced to ashes, and those who survived faced horrific burns, disfigurement, and radiation poisoning. 3 days later, the bomb on Nagasaki killed an additional 70,000 people. But the devastation didn't end there. The survivors, known as hibakusha, lived with the physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Many suffered from cancer, genetic mutations, and psychological trauma, all caused by the radiation. The bombings were a grim reminder of the catastrophic potential of nuclear weapons and remain a powerful symbol of the horrors of war. 7. The Soviet Great Purge. Stalin's Reign of Terror, 1937 to 1938. In the late 1930s, Joseph Stalin, the dictator of the Soviet Union, launched a campaign of terror known as the Great Purge. During this period, Stalin sought to eliminate anyone he considered a threat to his power, from political rivals to ordinary citizens. The purge resulted in the imprisonment, torture, and execution of millions of people, with estimates ranging from 600,000 to 1.2 million killed. The victims of the Great Purge were often arrested without any evidence, and many were tortured into confessing crimes they hadn't committed. Show trials were staged, and entire families were sent to labor camps where they were worked to death in brutal conditions. The most chilling part of the purge was the way it turned people against each other. Neighbors, colleagues, and even family members were encouraged to denounce one another, often out of fear for their own lives. Stalin's reign of terror left a deep scar on Soviet society, instilling fear and paranoia that lasted for generations. 8. The Rwandan Genocide, a nation torn apart, 1994. In 1994, Rwanda, a small country in Central Africa, was plunged into one of the most brutal genocides in modern history. Over the course of just 100 days, an estimated 800,000 Tutsi people were slaughtered by their Hutu neighbors. The violence was orchestrated by the Hutu government, who encouraged ordinary citizens to take up machetes and kill their Tutsi neighbors. What made the genocide so horrifying was the speed and brutality of the killings. Men, women, and children were hacked to death in their homes, schools, and churches. Neighbors who had once lived peacefully together turned on each other in an orgy of violence. The world watched in horror as the international community failed to intervene in time to stop the slaughter. The Rwandan genocide remains a painful reminder of the capacity for hatred and cruelty within humanity and the devastating consequences of failing to act in the face of injustice. 9. The Atlantic Slave Trade. An ocean of suffering. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, millions of Africans were forcibly taken from their homes and shipped across the Atlantic to the Americas as part of the transatlantic slave trade. This was one of the largest forced migrations in history, and the suffering endured by the enslaved people was unimaginable. Men, women, and children were packed into the holds of ships like cargo, with little regard for their well-being. Many did not survive the grueling voyage, succumbing to disease, starvation, or brutal treatment by their captors. Those who did survive were sold at auction blocks, where they were treated as property rather than people. Once in the Americas, the enslaved Africans were subjected to unimaginable cruelty. They worked on plantations under grueling conditions, often in the heat of the fields for 12-16 hours a day. Punishments for disobedience were harsh, ranging from whippings to mutilation or even execution. The legacy of the Atlantic slave trade continues to haunt the Americas, with descendants of enslaved people still grappling with the social, economic, and racial inequalities that were entrenched by centuries of slavery. 10. The Khmer Rouge regime and the Cambodian genocide, 1975 to 1979. Between 1975 and 1979, Cambodia was ruled by the Khmer Rouge, a communist regime led by Pol Pot. The Khmer Rouge sought to create an agrarian utopia, but the results were devastating. During this period, an estimated 1.5 to 2 million people, roughly a quarter of the country's population, died from execution, forced labor, starvation, and disease. The Khmer Rouge regime targeted intellectuals, professionals, ethnic minorities, and anyone who was seen as an enemy of the revolution. People were forced to abandon their homes and work in the fields under horrific conditions. Those who were suspected of being disloyal to the regime were tortured and executed in mass graves, with the infamous killing fields becoming a symbol of the brutality. The regime also sought to erase Cambodia's cultural heritage, destroying books, art, and religious sites in an effort to wipe out any traces of the country's history. The Cambodian genocide is a stark reminder of the devastating impact of totalitarianism and the depths of cruelty that can arise when a government seeks to impose its ideology at any cost. 11. The Irish Famine. Starvation, suffering, and death, 1845 to 1852. Between 1845 and 1852, Ireland was struck by a devastating famine caused by a potato blight that ruined the country's primary food source. Over 1 million people died from starvation and disease, while another million were forced to emigrate in search of a better life. The famine was made worse by British colonial policies, which prioritized the export of Irish food to England rather than using it to feed the starving population. This deliberate neglect by the British government led to widespread suffering, with entire villages decimated by hunger and disease. The famine had long-lasting effects on Ireland, from the loss of a significant portion of the population to the deep sense of betrayal felt by the Irish people towards the British government. The Irish famine is a painful chapter in the history of colonialism and serves as a reminder of the dangers of imperial exploitation. 12. The Trail of Tears. Forced relocation of Native Americans, 1830s. In the 1830s, the United States government enacted the Indian Removal Act, which led to the forced relocation of thousands of Native Americans from their ancestral lands to areas west of the Mississippi River, an event known as the Trail of Tears. Over 60,000 people from various tribes, including the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole, were forced to march in harsh conditions. The journey took place during the winter months, and many Native Americans were subjected to overcrowded conditions, insufficient food, and exposure to disease. As a result, thousands perished along the way, their bodies left behind on the unforgiving trail. The government's actions led to the displacement of entire tribes and the destruction of their cultures as they were moved to reservations where their lives were radically altered. The Trail of Tears remains a dark chapter in U.S. history, representing the violent and oppressive treatment of indigenous people. 13. The atomic bomb tests, the devastating effects on communities. After the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the U.S. government began a series of nuclear weapons tests, many of which had devastating effects on nearby communities and the environment. The infamous Nevada test site saw numerous atomic bombs detonated, with little regard for the health and safety of the nearby civilian population or the soldiers involved in the tests. People living in the surrounding areas were often unaware of the full effects of radiation exposure, and many suffered from various forms of cancer, respiratory issues, and birth defects. Military personnel were used as test subjects, placed in close proximity to detonations without protective gear and exposed to harmful radiation. The lasting environmental damage caused by these tests still lingers today, with entire ecosystems destroyed and generations of people suffering from the after-effects of radiation. These tests serve as a chilling reminder of the devastating power of nuclear weapons and the human cost of nuclear experimentation. 14. The Transatlantic Slave Trade, a legacy of suffering. The transatlantic slave trade stands as one of the darkest periods in human history, one that saw the forced transportation of over 12 million Africans to the Americas between the 16th and 19th centuries. Men, women, and children were captured, often through violent raids or warfare, and sold into slavery in the Americas, where they were subjected to horrific living and working conditions. The journey across the Atlantic, known as the Middle Passage, was one of unimaginable suffering. Enslaved people were packed into ships like cargo, chained together with little room to move, and given barely enough food or water to survive the journey. Many didn't make it, succumbing to disease, malnutrition, or violence. Upon arrival, those who survived were sold at slave markets and forced to work on plantations, in mines, or in households under brutal conditions. The trauma of separation from families, the loss of culture and heritage, and the brutal treatment endured by enslaved people left an indelible mark on history. The effects of the transatlantic slave trade still resonate in modern society, particularly in the form of racial inequality, systemic discrimination, and intergenerational trauma. 15. The Cambodian Killing Fields, Mass Murder under the Khmer Rouge, 1975 to 1979. From 1975 to 1979, Cambodia was under the control of the Khmer Rouge regime, a brutal communist government led by Pol Pot. In their attempt to create an agrarian utopia, the Khmer Rouge began a campaign of mass executions, forced labor, and destruction of cultural heritage, leading to the deaths of an estimated 1.5 to 2 million people, roughly a quarter of Cambodia's population at the time. The regime targeted intellectuals, ethnic minorities, religious groups, and anyone perceived as a threat to the communist revolution. People were forced into the countryside, where they were worked to death in brutal conditions. Those who were suspected of disloyalty were often arrested, tortured, and executed. The killing fields, a network of mass graves, became a symbol of the regime's horror, where victims were buried after being slaughtered by bullets, bludgeons, or even their bare hands. The genocide left a deep scar on the Cambodian people. Survivors were left with psychological trauma, and the destruction of Cambodia's cultural and intellectual life still has long-lasting effects. The Khmer Rouge's reign of terror remains one of the most harrowing examples of the dangers of unchecked political power and totalitarianism. Thanks for watching Warfare Codex. If you enjoyed this journey into history's strangest figures, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more amazing stories. See you in the next one.